The night was supposed to be peaceful. The small house in the suburbs of California sat quiet beneath a blanket of darkness, street lamps casting their dim amber glow on empty sidewalks that stretched toward the horizon. Inside, Sophia Bennett moved carefully through the modest living room, her hands resting gently on the swell of her belly. She was only a few months pregnant, and though her body ached deeply from the endless shifts she worked as a nurse at Los Angeles General Hospital, her heart still held on to hope like a candle flame refusing to die in the wind. She whispered softly to her unborn child, her voice tender and filled with promise. "You'll be loved, sweetheart. I promise you that. No matter what happens, you'll always be loved." But not everyone in that house shared her fragile hope, and the shadows gathering around her life were darker than she could have ever imagined. Marco Santoro had changed in ways that terrified Sophia, though she tried desperately not to admit it to herself. The man she had married 5 years ago bore almost no resemblance to the man who now walked through their door each evening like a storm cloud heavy with rain. Once, there had been something approaching warmth in his dark eyes, a certain controlled charm in the way he carried himself through the world. He had been a man of few words even then, speaking only when necessary, but his silence had felt protective rather than threatening, like a shield between her and the cruelty of the world outside. Now that silence carried a different weight entirely, a heaviness that pressed against Sophia's chest whenever he entered a room, making it difficult to breathe, difficult to think, difficult to remember what love had felt like before fear became her constant companion. Marco was not like other men, and he never had been. He came from old blood, Italian heritage that ran deep through his veins like wine through ancient vineyards. His family name, Santoro, carried a certain kind of respect in particular circles throughout Los Angeles. The kind of respect that came not from wealth displayed proudly in newspaper headlines or society pages, but from power exercised quietly in shadows, where ordinary people never ventured. He ran what appeared to be a legitimate auto repair shop on the edge of the city, a business inherited from his father and grandfather before him. But Sophia had learned over the years not to ask too many questions about the men who came and went at odd hours of the night, about the conversations conducted in low voices behind closed doors, about the thick envelopes of cash that appeared and disappeared without explanation or record. She had married him believing that love could exist even in darkness, that her gentle spirit could soften the hard edges of his world. She had been so desperately wrong, and now she was paying the price for that naive belief. That evening, Sophia had prepared a simple dinner with trembling hands and an anxious heart. Fresh pasta with marinara sauce, the kind Marco's late mother used to make according to old family recipes passed down through generations. She had practiced making it a dozen times over the past months, hoping to bring some warmth back into their home, some echo of happier times that seemed to belong to a different lifetime entirely. She wanted desperately to share news that had filled her with overwhelming joy during her shift at the hospital earlier that day. She had seen their baby's heartbeat on the ultrasound screen for the first time, had watched that tiny, miraculous flutter of life with tears streaming down her face while the technician smiled kindly at her obvious emotion. Her eyes had sparkled with anticipation all afternoon as she prepared the meal, waiting nervously for Marco to come home, praying silently that tonight would be different, that tonight he might remember how to be gentle. But when the front door opened with its familiar heavy sound, when she heard his footsteps crossing the threshold, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Marco entered without his usual controlled grace, without the careful precision that normally characterized his every movement. His footsteps were heavier tonight, his jaw tight with barely suppressed rage, and there was something wild flickering beneath his usually impenetrable exterior, like lightning behind dark clouds. He wore his customary dark suit, perfectly tailored as always, the fabric expensive and well cut, but his tie was loosened carelessly, and his collar was undone in a way that suggested chaos lurking just beneath the surface of his carefully maintained appearance. Behind him in the darkness, she could see the silhouettes of two of his men, Rocco and Enzo, waiting by the black Maserati parked at the curb, their presence serving as a silent warning to any neighbors who might be curious about the raised voices that would soon follow. The smell of expensive scotch clung to him heavily, though Marco never appeared drunk in the traditional sense. He was far too disciplined for that, too careful about maintaining control even when anger threatened to consume him entirely. But tonight, something fundamental had cracked in that iron composure he wore like armor against the world. His dark eyes, usually so carefully neutral, now burned with an emotion Sophia couldn't quite identify, but that terrified her to her core. Whose child is it? His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the warm domestic scene she had tried so hard to create, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation and barely controlled violence. Sophia froze completely, the serving spoon still clutched uselessly in her hand, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "What are you talking about, Marco? I don't understand what you're asking me." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, fear already creeping into her words despite her attempts to sound calm and reasonable. "The baby." He stepped closer, and she could see his eyes now in the dim kitchen light, dark and hard as river stones worn smooth by centuries of rushing water. "Tell me the truth, Sophia. Whose is it really?" His words were clipped, each syllable precise despite the alcohol on his breath, each question landing like a physical blow. Her heart hammered painfully against her ribs, adrenaline flooding her system as her body prepared for danger it had sensed before her mind fully comprehended the threat standing before her. "It's yours, Marco. This is our baby, our child. How can you even ask me something like that? How can you stand there and question whether your own child belongs to you?" But Marco didn't believe her, couldn't believe her, because Vanessa Lopez had made absolutely certain of that outcome. Vanessa was everything Sophia was not, at least in Marco's increasingly distorted perception of reality. Where Sophia wore simple scrubs and tied her hair back in practical ponytails for her nursing shifts, Vanessa draped herself in tight designer dresses and expensive perfume that announced her presence before she entered a room. She managed the Crimson Room, a trendy bar in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of establishment where the music never stopped and the night never truly ended, where people from Marco's shadow world conducted their business over expensive drinks in dark corners. She had spotted Marco months ago during one of his visits to her establishment, had recognized him immediately for what he was, a man of considerable power and control, a man whose world operated by different and more dangerous rules than those governing ordinary citizens. She had set her hooks carefully and deliberately, whispering poison into his ears during late-night meetings in her private booth at the back of the bar where the music was slightly quieter and conversations could be conducted without shouting. "A man like you doesn't deserve a wife who makes him look weak," she had purred seductively, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her touch calculated to inflame and manipulate. "She's too soft, too simple, too tied to her ordinary little life. You need someone who understands your world, someone who can stand beside you without flinching at what needs to be done." And then had come the carefully crafted lies, delivered with perfect timing and just enough detail to seem credible. "I saw her, Marco, at the hospital with another man. The way they looked at each other, the way she touched his arm." Vanessa had let the implication hang in the smoky air between them like a noose waiting to tighten. "That baby she's carrying, are you absolutely certain it's yours? When was the last time you two were even close enough for that to happen?" It was poison with no antidote, lies built on a foundation of nothing but air and malice. But Marco's world was constructed entirely on concepts of loyalty and betrayal, on trust earned and faith destroyed. In his experience, gleaned from years of operating in shadows, where everyone had secrets and everyone eventually showed their true nature, betrayal was not a question of if, but when. The seed of doubt, once planted in fertile soil, grew roots that strangled reason and logic until only suspicion remained. Sophia stepped backward instinctively as Marco moved toward the corner of the living room where shadows gathered thickest. His hand closed around something leaning against the wall near the fireplace, a wooden handle thick and solid and worn smooth by years of use. It was the tool he occasionally used for repairs around the house, heavy oak that had been in his family for generations, a simple implement that now became a weapon in hands twisted by lies and manufactured rage. "Marco, please." Sophia's voice broke as she clutched her stomach protectively, her arms wrapping instinctively around the small swell where their child grew. "I'm carrying your child, your baby. I've never betrayed you, not once, not ever. You have to believe me. For just a moment, for one single breath suspended in time, something flickered across his face that might have been doubt or recognition or the faintest ghost of the man he used to be. But then Vanessa's carefully crafted words echoed in his mind again, her voice drowning out the truth, standing vulnerable and terrified before him, and his jaw clenched with terrible finality. When he raised the wooden handle, there was no hesitation in the movement, no last-minute reconsideration or mercy. The first blow struck her shoulder with brutal precision. Pain exploded through Sophia's body like lightning striking from a clear sky, white-hot and devastating and utterly overwhelming. She cried out in shock and agony, stumbling backward, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. But still her arms remained wrapped protectively around her belly. Still her only thought was for the fragile life growing inside her. Tears blurred her vision instantly as she fell to her knees on the cold hardwood floor. "Marco, stop, please. I'm begging you for the baby's sake. For our child." Her words came out in desperate gasps between sobs, her voice raw with terror and pain and incomprehension. But he struck again, without pause, without mercy, and then again. Each blow was measured and controlled, even in rage, delivered with the same terrible precision he brought to everything in his life. This was not the wild violence of a man who had lost control to alcohol or temporary insanity. This was something far colder, far more terrifying. This was a man who believed fundamentally that his honor had been violated, his trust betrayed, his position in the world undermined by the woman he had taken into his home and his life. In Marco's world, shaped by generations of men who valued respect above all else, such transgressions demanded retribution swift and absolute. Sophia tried desperately to shield her stomach, tried to protect the innocent life that had no part in the lies and manipulations swirling around them like a poisonous fog. Every part of her screamed in agony as blow after blow landed, but she fought with every ounce of strength she possessed to stay conscious, to keep breathing, to survive for the sake of her unborn child who depended entirely on her continued existence. She whispered through her sobs, her voice barely audible even in the terrible silence between impacts. "Stay with me, little one. Please stay strong. Mommy's here. Mommy won't let go." The room began to spin sickeningly around her. Darkness crept in steadily at the edges of her vision, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. She felt herself falling as if from a great height, felt the cold, hardwood floor rising up to meet her cheek with jarring impact. Blood trickled slowly from her split lip, copper-tasting and warm, and her breath came in shallow, labored gasps that seemed to require more effort than her battered body could provide. The last thing she heard before unconsciousness finally claimed her, like a dark tide pulling her under, was Marco's voice, flat and emotionless and utterly devoid of the warmth she had once foolishly believed existed somewhere deep inside him. "You brought this on yourself, Sophia. Remember that." Then there was nothing but merciful darkness and the distant sound of a door closing as he walked away from what he had done, walked away from her broken body lying crumpled on the floor like a discarded doll. Outside in the quiet suburban neighborhood where families slept peacefully behind locked doors and drawn curtains, a single light flickered on in a window across the street. Someone had heard the cries echoing through thin walls, had heard the unmistakable sounds of violence being perpetrated behind closed doors, had heard another human being in desperate need of help. Trembling hands reached for a telephone, fingers shaking as they dialed 911, a voice whispering urgently to the operator about screams and thuds and something terrible happening in the house across the way. Neither Marcos Santoro nor Vanessa Lopez could possibly have known in that moment that this single phone call from a concerned neighbor would set in motion a storm of consequences that would ultimately destroy everything they thought they had built and controlled. They could not have known that Sophia Bennett, the woman they believed thoroughly broken and utterly powerless, had three brothers scattered across the country who would move heaven and earth itself to protect their baby sister once they learned what had been done to her. And when those brothers finally discovered the full nightmare that Sophia had been living in terrified silence, when they understood the depth of Marco's cruelty and Vanessa's manipulation, Marco Santoro would learn a harsh lesson that his world of shadows and respect and carefully maintained power could not protect him from the consequences of his actions. Sophia Bennett had never imagined that her life would spiral into such consuming darkness, had never dreamed during her hopeful youth that love could transform so completely into fear and pain. At 28 years old, she embodied everything her chosen profession demanded of its practitioners. She was compassionate almost to a fault, dedicated beyond reason, selfless in ways that sometimes worried even her closest friends. Every morning, long before the sun rose over the Los Angeles skyline, she tied her dark hair back into a neat, practical bun, slipped into her pale blue scrubs that had been washed so many times that they were soft as silk against her skin, and walked through the long, fluorescent-lit corridors of Los Angeles General Hospital with a smile that never quite reached her tired eyes anymore, but that her patients found comforting nonetheless. Those patients absolutely adored her without exception. They spoke among themselves and to anyone who would listen about her gentle hands that seemed to ease pain just through touch, about her kind eyes that looked at them with genuine concern rather than the clinical detachment so many medical professionals developed in as protection against the endless suffering they witnessed daily. She was the type of nurse who stayed long after her official shift had ended, just to sit with a lonely patient who had no family, to hold wrinkled hands spotted with age and illness, to offer comfort and human connection to people who desperately needed both. Her heart seemed to be made of pure compassion, shaped and refined by years of caring for others at the expense of caring for herself. And everyone who knew her professionally could see this quality shining through her every action except, tragically, the man she had loved most deeply and sacrificed most completely for. Sophia had married Marco Santoro 5 years ago in a small, strangely formal ceremony that had felt more like a business transaction than a celebration of love and commitment, though she had been too young and naive to recognize that uncomfortable truth at the time. His family had been there in force, somber men in expensive dark suits who spoke in hushed Italian to each other and watched her with assessing eyes that made her feel like livestock being evaluated for purchase. She had been only 23 then, young and idealistic, and utterly convinced that love could bridge any divide between two people, that her gentle nature could soften even the hardest heart if she just tried hard enough and gave generously enough of herself. Marco had been different in those early days, or perhaps she had simply been too blinded by infatuation to see the truth of who and what he really was beneath the controlled exterior. He had been struggling financially then, or so she had believed based on his careful explanations. His auto repair shop inherited from his father was small and barely profitable according to the story he told her, drowning in debt and losing customers to larger, flashier competitors with better locations and more modern equipment. Sophia, with the fierce devotion of a young woman deeply in love for the first time in her life, had believed in him with an intensity that now seemed embarrassingly naive in retrospect. She had worked double shifts at the hospital until exhaustion made her stumble, pouring her modest paychecks into keeping their household afloat and funding what she earnestly believed was his dream of legitimate business success and financial stability for their future family. Her friends had tried to warn her repeatedly, had expressed concern about the imbalance in their relationship with increasing directness as time passed. "You're too selfless, Sophie," they would say over coffee or lunch, their voices heavy with worry, and they tried unsuccessfully to disguise as casual observation. "You give absolutely everything and ask for nothing in return. That's not how healthy relationships work. You're going to burn yourself out completely." But Sophia had only laughed at their concerns, brushing them aside with the confidence of someone who believed she had found a truth that others simply couldn't understand. "That's what real love is," she would say with conviction that now felt painfully misguided. "That's what marriage means, what commitment requires. You support each other through difficult times." For years that stretched into what felt like an eternity, she poured every single ounce of her energy and resources into their marriage, never once questioning her role as his partner, his supporter, his wife, his financial backbone, never once stopping to wonder if perhaps the sacrifice was flowing only in one direction. She had ignored so many warning signs that seemed obvious in hindsight. The late-night meetings that Marco claimed were necessary for business, but that stretched well past midnight. The phone calls he took in other rooms, his voice dropping to an inaudible murmur whenever she came near. the men who came and went from their home like shadows, appearing and disappearing without introduction or explanation. She told herself these were simply the normal struggles of a small business owner trying desperately to surrender in a brutally competitive world, that her discomfort was just her own ignorance about how businesses operated in certain industries. Looking back now from her hospital bed, Sophia could barely recognize the naive woman she had been, the woman who had convinced herself that willful blindness was the same thing as trust. But everything had changed, had curdled like milk left too long in summer heat, when Vanessa Lopez entered their lives like a poison slowly seeping into their marriage. At first, Sophia hadn't understood what was happening, hadn't recognized the signs of another woman's deliberate interference. She had only noticed that Marco was staying out progressively later each night, that his excuses for his absences grew thinner and more implausible, that he seemed increasingly irritated by her very existence. He stopped touching her with even the controlled affection he had shown before. His rare kisses became perfunctory and obligatory, delivered like duties to be checked off a list rather than expressions of genuine feeling. When he looked at her now, she no longer saw even the limited warmth he had once displayed. Instead, she saw only cold assessment, as if he were constantly measuring her worth against some unknown standard and finding her perpetually disappointingly lacking. She would wait by the window late into the night like a character from a sad story, her hands folded protectively over her growing belly, hoping desperately that he would come home with some trace of the man she had married, some echo of the person she had believed him to be. Instead, he returned with bitterness etched into every line of his face, with criticism sharp on his tongue. He found fault with her cooking, mocked her long hours at the hospital that were paying their bills, questioned why she was always so tired when she finally stumbled home after 16-hour shifts spent on her feet. "Maybe you're tired because you're doing more than just working," he had said one particularly painful night, his voice carrying that dangerous quiet that always preceded something worse, something she didn't want to contemplate. Sophia hadn't understood his meaning at first, her exhausted mind unable to process the accusation hidden in his words. "What do you mean by that, Marco? I don't understand what you are trying to say." He had simply stared at her with those cold, dark eyes, his expression unreadable as carved stone. "Figure it out yourself," was all he said before turning away, leaving her alone with her mounting confusion and growing, gnawing fear. Even during those increasingly painful moments when she felt their marriage crumbling around her like a house built on sand during high tide, Sophia had told herself firmly to endure, to be patient, to keep faith that things would eventually improve if she just held on a little longer. She reminded herself constantly of the child growing inside her body, of the tiny heartbeat she had seen flickering bravely on the ultrasound screen, like a candle flame refusing to be extinguished. She whispered promises to her unborn baby late at night when Marco was gone to whatever mysterious business kept him away, when she was alone in their bed that felt far too large and cold. "Mommy will protect you, sweetheart. Mommy will never give up on you, no matter what happens. No matter how hard things get, you'll always be safe and loved." It had been her way of keeping faith alive, even as her marriage disintegrated around her, even as fear became her constant companion, and hope seemed increasingly like a luxury she could no longer afford. Sophia's strength throughout her life had always come from her family, from the unshakable foundation they had provided since childhood. She was the youngest of four siblings, the only daughter, the baby of the Bennett family, who had been simultaneously protected and encouraged to be independent by her three older brothers. Though she now lived in California with Marco, far from where she had grown up, her three older brothers were scattered strategically across the country like chess pieces on a board, each having built impressive empires of their own through intelligence, determination, and the kind of driving ambition that seemed to run in their blood. Ethan, the eldest by nearly a decade, ruled the real estate world from his gleaming tower office in New York City. He was powerful in ways that made even other powerful men uncomfortable. Strict and demanding, but utterly devoted to family in the way that only eldest children who had helped raise their younger siblings could be. Matthew, the second brother, had built his considerable fortune through finance, operating out of San Francisco with a calm brilliance and strategic thinking that made him essentially untouchable in his field. Lucas, the youngest brother before Sophia, and closest to her in age, was bold and passionate and occasionally reckless. A tech genius who had revolutionized aspects of his industry from his sprawling campus in Silicon Valley. They were extraordinarily busy men, important men whose time was measured in millions of dollars and whose decisions affected thousands of people's lives and livelihoods. Yet deep in Sophia's heart, buried beneath layers of shame and fear, she had always maintained a fundamental belief that they would come for her if she truly needed them, that the bonds of blood and family would prove stronger than distance or demanding schedules or any other obstacle that might stand in their way. They had protected her fiercely throughout childhood, had threatened boyfriends and scared away anyone they deemed unworthy of their baby sister's attention, had promised her solemnly at various points in her life that they would always, always be there when she needed them. But Sophia, drowning in shame and self-blame, had never told them about the bruises that appeared on her arms and shoulders like dark flowers blooming beneath her skin. She had never mentioned during their brief, increasingly infrequent phone calls, the nights she cried herself to sleep, with her face pressed into her pillow to muffle the sounds. She had never spoken a word about the fear that gripped her heart with icy fingers whenever she heard Marco's car pulling into the driveway, never admitted that she had begun to dread her own husband's presence in their home. She was so deeply, painfully ashamed of what her life had become, ashamed in ways that made it difficult to breathe whenever she thought too hard about her situation. She thought that if she just stayed quiet and endured a while longer, if she just tried a little harder to be a better wife, things would somehow magically improve. She wanted desperately to believe that Marco would eventually return to being the man she had fallen in love with, even though some part of her was beginning to suspect that man had perhaps never truly existed at all, that she had simply projected her hopes and dreams onto someone fundamentally incapable of being who she needed him to be. And so Sophia had carried her secret pain like a heavy stone lodged permanently in her chest, hiding the physical marks of violence under long sleeves even during sweltering California summers, painting on increasingly brittle smiles at work that fooled everyone except perhaps herself. Her coworkers praised her strength and dedication constantly, held her up as an example of nursing excellence, had no idea whatsoever that the woman who cared so tenderly for everyone else was slowly, steadily breaking apart inside like glass, developing invisible cracks before it finally shatters. No one knew the truth about what happened behind the closed doors of her modest suburban house, not her colleagues at the hospital where she worked such long hours, not her friends who had gradually drifted away as she made excuse after excuse for why she couldn't meet them anymore. Not even her brothers, who loved her fiercely, but who she kept carefully at arm's length through cheerful, empty phone calls that revealed nothing of substance about her deteriorating life. Inside, where no one could see, she was breaking. Each day brought another crack in her spirit, another piece of herself that fell away like plaster from a damaged wall, until she sometimes lay awake late at night wondering with genuine terror if there would be anything left of who she had once been when this was all finally over, however it ended. That night, as she lay unconscious and bleeding on the cold living room floor, the phone call from that observant neighbor brought flashing red and blue lights racing to her doorstep, like vengeful angels arriving too late to prevent tragedy, but perhaps just in time to begin the long, difficult process of justice. And once those ambulance doors opened, once her name was entered into official hospital records with detailed documentation of her injuries, once doctors and nurses who knew her began asking pointed questions about how she had sustained such systematic damage, her brothers would finally, inevitably discover the nightmare their baby sister had been living in silent, terrified isolation. The storm they would bring in response was building on the horizon like thunderclouds gathering before a hurricane. Marco Santoro simply didn't know it yet, didn't understand that the phone call to 911 had set in motion consequences that would ultimately destroy everything he had built, everything he thought his power and reputation could protect. He would learn soon enough that there were forces in this world that even his carefully constructed empire of shadows and respect could not stand against, that hurting Sophia Bennett had been the single worst mistake of his entire life. The flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles painted the quiet suburban street in urgent, pulsing colors that seemed obscene against the peaceful darkness of sleeping homes. Neighbors emerged cautiously from their houses, some still in pajamas or bathrobes, drawn irresistibly by the commotion that had shattered their evening's peace. They gathered in small clusters on lawns and sidewalks, whispering to each other in shock and morbid fascination, trying desperately to piece together what terrible thing had happened in the modest house that had always seemed so ordinary and unremarkable from the outside. Paramedics rushed inside with practiced efficiency, their movements quick and sure despite the late hour, carrying equipment that gleamed silver under the streetlights. Sophia Bennett lay motionless on the living room floor where she had fallen, her skin pale as moonlight, her lips trembling despite her unconscious state, her arms still wrapped protectively around her belly in that instinctive maternal gesture that had persisted even as awareness faded into darkness. The wooden handle Marco had used as a weapon rested in the corner where he had dropped it carelessly after the beating, a silent wooden witness to the cruelty that had unfolded within walls that should have represented safety and love. Inside the ambulance, as it pulled away from the curb with lights blazing and sirens beginning their urgent wail, Sophia's breathing remained shallow and labored, each breath a struggle against damaged ribs and traumatized lungs. A young paramedic with kind eyes pressed an oxygen mask gently over her bruised face, while his partner worked frantically to establish an IV line and checked desperately for signs of the baby's heartbeat using portable monitoring equipment. His hands moved with practiced efficiency born of years of emergency response, but his expression betrayed deep concern that he tried unsuccessfully to hide from his colleague. "She's pregnant," he said urgently, his voice tight with worry that came from understanding exactly how precarious the situation had become. "Several months along from the looks of it. We need to get her to Los Angeles General immediately. Priority 1. Every second counts now." The words echoed in the narrow space of the ambulance, bouncing off metal walls, a chilling reminder that two innocent lives hung in the balance tonight, rather than just one, that the violence perpetrated in that quiet house had endangered not only a woman, but the child growing inside her body. As the vehicle sped down the freeway with traffic parting before its urgent passage, sirens wailing into the night like a mechanical cry for help, Sophia drifted in and out of consciousness, floating in that strange liminal space where dreams and memories blur together into something neither quite real nor entirely imaginary. Her mind, trying desperately to protect itself from overwhelming trauma, retreated into fragments of better times. She thought hazily of her baby, of that impossibly tiny heartbeat she had seen on the ultrasound screen just hours earlier, had watched with tears of joy streaming down her face while the technicians smiled at her obvious emotion. She thought of the promise she had made to that precious life, the vow to protect and cherish and love unconditionally no matter what challenges they might face together. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, barely audible even in the relative quiet of the ambulance's interior. "Stay with me, little one. Please stay with me. Mommy's here. Mommy won't leave you." Back at the house that had become a crime scene, Marco stood in the doorway with his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with carefully controlled breaths, his face an unreadable mask that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts might be churning behind those dark eyes. He didn't follow the ambulance that carried his wife away to an uncertain fate. He didn't express concern or remorse or anything resembling human emotion. He simply watched as the vehicle disappeared into the night, its red lights fading into the distance like dying embers, until even the sound of its sirens was swallowed by the vast indifference of the sleeping city. From the shadows behind him, moving with the practiced grace of a predator who has successfully separated prey from the herd, Vanessa Lopez emerged. She wore a tight dress despite the late hour, her makeup perfect, her expensive perfume announcing her presence even before she spoke. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on Marco's arm in a gesture of possession, disguised as comfort, her voice smooth as aged whiskey and just as intoxicating to someone already impaired by poor judgment. "You did what you had to do, Marco," she said with false sympathy, dripping from every word like honey laced with poison. "She disrespected you, lied to you, made a fool of you. That child she's carrying isn't yours. We both know that's true. This was necessary." She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "We'll build something better together now, something real and honest. You don't need her anymore. You never really did." Her words wrapped around him like chains forged from manipulation and carefully crafted lies, pulling him deeper into the web she had woven with such patient skill over these past months. Marco said nothing in response, his jaw tight with tension, his eyes dark and unreadable as polished obsidian. But he didn't pull away from her touch either, didn't reject the poisonous comfort she offered, and his silence in that moment was perhaps more damning than any words could have been. Meanwhile, across the city in the building where Sophia had dedicated so many years of her professional life, Los Angeles General Hospital erupted into controlled chaos as word spread rapidly through the emergency department that a critical patient was incoming. The emergency department, usually busy even during late-night hours with the endless stream of human tragedy and medical crisis that defines urban healthcare, suddenly kicked into an even higher gear of activity as nurses and doctors mobilized in response to the urgent call from paramedics still en route. When the ambulance finally screamed to a halt outside the emergency entrance and its rear doors burst open to reveal the patient inside, medical staff moved as one practiced, synchronized unit that had performed this dance countless times before, but never with someone they knew personally. Sophia was transferred quickly but carefully to a waiting gurney, IV lines already started, and running clear fluids into her damaged body, monitoring equipment beeping with urgent insistence, oxygen mask fogging rhythmically with each shallow breath. And then, as she passed under the bright lights of the trauma bay entrance, someone recognized her despite the bruising that had already begun to darken and swell her delicate features almost beyond recognition. "Wait," a nurse gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock and horror. "Oh my God, that's Sophia. That's Sophia Bennett. She's one of us." The recognition rippled through the assembled medical team like an electric shock coursing through water. Sophia Bennett wasn't just another anonymous patient wheeled through their doors, another victim of urban violence whose story they would never fully know. She was their colleague, their friend, the gentle woman who had worked alongside them for years through countless difficult shifts, the woman who had held their hands during their own moments of crisis and doubt, who had brought coffee during endless overnight shifts, who had celebrated their victories and mourned their losses as if they were her own. Now she lay before them broken and bleeding, transformed in an instant from caregiver to victim. And the cognitive dissonance of seeing her so vulnerable and damaged was almost more than some of them could bear. "Get Dr. Morrison down here immediately," someone ordered, their voice sharp with urgency that came from genuine emotional investment rather than merely professional obligation. "And page OBGYN stat. We need fetal monitoring started right now. This baby's life depends on how fast we move." Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the emergency department that turned everyone's skin a sickly shade of pale green. Doctors worked with intense focus and grim determination, their faces set in expressions that revealed nothing of the emotions churning beneath their professional exteriors. They stabilized Sophia's vital signs, treated her numerous wounds with careful attention to detail that would be crucial if this ever went to court, documented every single bruise and laceration with the precise methodology required for potential legal proceedings. The baby's heartbeat, fragile but miraculously persistent like a candle flame that refused to be extinguished despite strong winds trying to blow it out, provided the only real glimmer of hope in an otherwise devastating situation that had shaken the entire hospital staff. Outside the trauma bay where Sophia fought for her life and her child's survival, nurses and other staff members gathered in hushed, shocked clusters. Some wept openly, not bothering to hide tears that spoke of genuine grief and rage at what had been done to one of their own. Others stood in stunned, almost dissociative silence, struggling to process how this could have happened to Sophia of all people. Gentle Sophia who wouldn't hurt anyone, who gave so much of herself to others. How had this violence been perpetrated against someone so fundamentally good? How had none of them known she was suffering? How had they missed the signs that must surely have been there if only they had looked more carefully, asked better questions, pushed past her reassurances that everything was fine? "She never said anything," one nurse whispered to another, her voice breaking with guilt and sorrow. "She came to work every single day with that smile, asked about our families, acted like everything in her life was perfectly normal. How did we not see it? How did we miss something this serious happening to someone we see almost every day?" The night stretched on endlessly, each hour feeling like days, heavy with uncertainty and fear, and the weight of questions that had no good answers. And thousands of miles away across the vast expanse of the American continent, in three different cities where powerful men built empires and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Three brothers were about to have their worlds disrupted in ways they could never have anticipated in their worst nightmares. Ethan Bennett sat in his towering corner office, overlooking the glittering lights of Manhattan spread out below him like a kingdom he had conquered through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. The New York skyline stretched endlessly before his floor-to-ceiling windows, a testament to everything he had built and achieved through years of relentless work. He was deep into a late-night meeting with international investors who had flown in specifically to speak with him, discussing a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, when his private cell phone rang with its distinctive tone. He almost ignored it out of habit, almost let it go to voicemail as he did with 90% of calls that came through during business hours. Almost, but something indefinable made him glance at the screen, some instinct honed over decades, and when he saw the California area code, his blood ran suddenly cold in his veins for reasons he couldn't immediately articulate. He answered, his voice crisp and professional as always. Bennett speaking. The words that followed from the hospital administrator, delivered in that carefully controlled tone that medical professionals use when delivering catastrophic news, made him go completely and utterly still. His international investors watched in growing confusion as all color drained from his normally composed face. As his hand gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white as bone, as his eyes went distant and unfocused, as if he were seeing something terrible that existed only in his mind. Your sister Sophia has been brought to Los Angeles General Hospital, the administrator was saying, her voice professional but not unkind, carefully modulated to deliver devastating information without causing additional trauma. She was attacked in her home. Her injuries are serious, Mr. Bennett. You should come as soon as possible. In San Francisco, in an immaculate office that reflected the ordered precision of its occupant's mind, Matthew Bennett was reviewing dense financial reports late into the evening when his phone buzzed insistently on the polished surface of his desk. Unlike his eldest brother Ethan, Matthew rarely showed strong emotion under any circumstances. His face typically maintained as a carefully controlled mask of calm professionalism that had served him well in the cutthroat world of high finance, where showing weakness meant losing everything. But when he answered the call and heard about Sophia, when the words penetrated his analytical brain and their meaning became clear, that impenetrable mask cracked visibly. His hand trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly, as he very carefully set down his expensive fountain pen, the one that had been a gift from Sophia for his birthday 3 years ago. I'm on my way, he said simply, his voice colder than his colleagues had ever heard it, dropping to a temperature that would have made wiser men step back and reconsider whatever they had been planning to say. I'll be in Los Angeles within hours. And in Silicon Valley, in a sprawling tech campus that bore his name and represented everything he had built from nothing through brilliance and determination. Lucas Bennett was deep into coding, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he worked on his latest project, completely absorbed in the elegant problem-solving that had always been his refuge from the messy complications of human relationships. He was the youngest of the brothers, the one closest in age to Sophia, passionate and quick-tempered and intense in ways that sometimes worried his more controlled siblings. When his phone rang and he heard about his sister's condition, when the nurse on the other end of the line described in clinical terms what had been done to Sophia, he nearly destroyed his custom-made desk in an explosion of rage so sudden and complete that his nearby employees scattered in genuine fear. He heard her, Lucas shouted into the phone, his voice shaking with a fury so intense it was almost incoherent. Someone put their hands on my sister? Someone dared to touch Sophia? Without the slightest hesitation, without pausing even to shut down his computer or collect his belongings, he was grabbing his keys and heading for the door while simultaneously pulling up flight information on his phone with hands that shook with barely suppressed violence. Tell Ethan I'll meet him in Los Angeles, he said to his confused assistant who had rushed over at the commotion. And tell whoever did this to our sister, tell them to pray the police get to them before we do. By sunrise, as the California sky slowly lightened from black to deep purple to pale gold, three of the most powerful and influential CEOs in America would be converging on Los Angeles from their separate corners of the country. And when they discovered the full extent of what Marcos Santoro had done to their baby sister, when they saw the bruises marking her skin and understood the depth of cruelty that had been inflicted on someone they loved fiercely and had sworn to always protect, Marco's carefully constructed world of shadows and control and hard-earned respect would begin crumbling around him like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The Bennett brothers were coming, united by blood and purpose and rage, and nothing would ever be the same again for anyone involved in this tragedy. The reckoning had begun.